This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Orbis.
Jim Lechner served in the U.S. Army for 27 years and participated in 8 operational deployments, including in Somalia, the Sinai, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Jim also served numerous tours at the Central Intelligence Agency. Since his retirement from the U.S. military in 2011, Jim served in Afghanistan as a counterinsurgency advisor, as well as providing support for other U.S. government efforts. He is also a supporter of a number of veterans charities. Jim joins us today to talk about his new book on his time in Somalia and his recent experience in Ukraine. We'll be right back with that discussion after a quick break. I'm Michael Morrell, and this is Intelligence Matters. Rooted in the U.S. intelligence and special operations communities, Orbis is investing today in the people and capabilities needed to deliver national security tomorrow. Data is everywhere and easy to acquire. The intelligence mission requires new thinking and new approaches to make the most of that data. That's where Orbis is making a difference. Unburdened by legacy business models, we're building the intelligence business of the future. We provide highly empowered, creative teams that deliver impactful outcomes and asymmetric capabilities for our clients worldwide. If you're looking for a strategic ally with experience navigating the complexities of the modern information environment, or if you envision contributing your unique experiences to elevate global security, then we're ready for you. Connect with us at intelligencematters@orbis.com. That's intelligencematters@orbis.com. Uncover the extraordinary with Orbis. Jim, welcome to Intelligence Matters. It is very nice to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. Great to be here. Honored.
Jim, you're joining us today from your beautiful home, and I'd love to jump right in here. Last fall, you published a book titled "With My Shield: An Army Ranger in Somalia." It's a terrific book. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great relief to get it finally published. It only took me like 4 weeks to write it, but 4 years to get it published. So thank you very much.
I know how that works. Let me tell you. Right. Jim, the book tells the story of your deployment to Somalia in 1993 and your participation in what came to be known as Black Hawk Down, which was, captured in a best-selling book by Mark Bowden and a subsequent Academy Award-winning film. And maybe the place to start is with the mission of that task force that you were on in Somalia. What were you all there to do?
Sure, Michael. So our mission was the Joint Special Operations Task Force, and this was under the Clinton administration in the 90s. It was a very restrained approach, very restrained environment. And so our mission specifically was to capture the leader of the Somali insurgency that was resisting the UN. It was hoped that if we could take out the leader of this insurgent group, that the insurgency and resistance to the United Nations effort would collapse. And so that's what the mission was given to us. We were supposed to be very restrained in our approach to capture him. We could defend ourselves, but it was one of these don't necessarily fire until fired upon type of approaches back in the early 90s.
And where were you in your military career at that point?
So at that time, I was a young lieutenant. I was in the 3rd Ranger Battalion. There's 3 Ranger Battalions in the Army. I was in the 3rd Ranger Battalion. It's a special operations unit. It's really, overall, it's an incredible story of Task Force Ranger, but for me individually, it was really an odyssey that I talk about in the book. But it was my last 2 weeks in the battalion. I was getting ready to leave and go off to my next assignment. I was on my last training deployment. I had just gotten married. I was thinking about my next assignment, and then the orders came down for our battalion to provide 1 company out of our 3 companies. And it was not going to be the company I was assigned to. I was assigned to Alpha Company. And just after we got that word, a runner came in calling me to the commander's headquarters and said my counterpart in B Company had just left on emergency leave. So me and 1 or 2 other guys got pulled into B Company and sent on the mission. And literally like my last week in the battalion.
So then tell us what happened. Walk us through, from your vantage point, Jim, what happened on October 3rd, 1993.
Sure. October 3rd was actually our seventh mission. We'd been on the ground for about 6 weeks, trying to capture General Adid. We'd been unsuccessful in that. The intelligence approach was extremely difficult. I talk about this in the book, but we were kind of taking a Cold War approach. We were using a P-3 Orion submarine hunter and some other things to try to kind of track him down. It was nothing like the later war on terrorism. We didn't have much of a human network, so it was very difficult to try to track him down. He was in a very homogenous environment with his tribe, had some very good counter techniques to what we were doing. He never used any kind of radio or never used any kind of communications device besides passing notes through secured, runners.
Mm-hmm.
So this was our seventh mission. We tried a couple times to get him, and we couldn't. We just missed him. They'd finally expanded the target list to taking down some of his top leadership, and so by the seventh mission, by the first week in October, we'd identified a meeting, and this was through a human intelligence source. Identified a meeting that was going on of all of his top leadership of his insurgent group. We knew he was not going to be there, but we thought at this point it was a lucrative enough target to take down all of his lieutenants, all of his supporting group. The meeting was being held in the middle of his stronghold, if you would, about 500,000 people in a tribal ghetto in northwest Mogadishu. This was in the stronghold of that area. So on October 3rd, it was a daylight operation. The meeting was going to take place around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By 3:30, we were ready to launch. The target had been confirmed by human intelligence, marking on the ground, and we launched the task force. But knowing full well the dangers of going into his stronghold, and knowing full well it was a risk going in at daylight, and that's what we decided to do based on what we've been able to achieve in the past, and based on what we felt was the value of the target.
Yeah. So where were you, and what happened?
So I was a lieutenant at the time. I was a fire support officer, which means I was in charge of calling in the fire support assets. In this case, it was two Black Hawk helicopters orbiting above the target with snipers on board. And me and my forward observers, I had a forward observer at each ranger position, and we would call in targets, call in threats that we're encountering. And so we would talk to the Black Hawk helicopter with the snipers on board and give them directions and where to come in. So I went in with the assault force. I fast roped in out of a helicopter with the company commander. Again, there was 4 Ranger blocking positions. I went into the southeast blocking position, a group of about 17 Rangers on the ground where I was at. Just over 60 Rangers on the ground forming a perimeter around the target. And again, I was at the southeast corner calling in threats and targets to the Blackhawks orbiting above.
And then what happened at that point?
We were about 50 minutes into the mission. Our missions generally would take less than an hour, and we knew from the enemy threat and our analysis and our experience that if we could be on the ground for less than an hour, we could get in and out before the Somalis could react to us. Mm-hmm. And so we've been on the ground for about 45 minutes. We were taking a good bit of fire from the Somalis. There was some resistance going on the ground, a security force because of the large meeting. And so I was calling a Black Hawk in. The Black Hawk's call sign was Super 61. I was calling that Black Hawk in to try to find some gunmen that were shooting at us. They'd stopped shooting, but the pilot, Cliff Walcott, was a warrior, and he wanted to get the snipers in a position to take a shot and try to find them. So he came in low and slow. And what we didn't know was that an Al-Qaeda advisor, they'd been advising Adid's forces on how to modify rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank weapons to shoot at helicopters. So they'd done that. They'd trained them and modified some weapons. And one of those gunners was over in that area and was able to line up Cliff's aircraft and hit it with a rocket-propelled grenade and bring it down about 4 blocks to the east of the target.
Yeah, yeah. And then it became a struggle for everybody to get the hell out of there and get home, right?
Sure. Yeah. Everything changed dynamically from a very well-oiled precision strike that was going to take place in less than an hour. In fact, we were actually loading the prisoners up. We had a convoy that come out to meet us of our guys, some Humvees and some soft-skin 5-ton trucks. We'd loaded up the prisoners and getting out within the time frame. But the world changed about 180 degrees. Now we were going to have to get to that crash site because it was outside of our perimeter. It had crashed in the territory controlled by the Somali National Alliance, or the Haber Getter, the insurgents we were fighting. They crashed about 4 blocks away. There was less than 100 of us on the ground, but we moved to that crash site and basically had to fight it out to get the injured guys because there was actually survivors. Tragically, the two pilots were killed in the crash, but we had to try to get the survivors out who were badly injured, and then we had to try to recover those bodies that were literally crushed underneath the helicopter as it came down. So it really became a huge fight for a number of reasons. One, because now it's taking more time. It's beyond an hour. The Somalis are able to react. There's literally tens of thousands of fighters on the ground converging, trying to find that site, trying to find us, and then try to fight their way on and overrun that objective. And so that's the position we found ourselves in about an hour and a half after we hit the ground.
Yeah. So, Jim, what was it like then to fight your way back to the base? How long did that take? What was that? What was that like for you? What was the fight like on the ground?
Yeah, it was really incredible. One of the things about this battle, and I've been in a lot of battles, but one of the things about this was the amount of moving parts and different sub battles, if you would, going on. And one of those was the convoy that had come to join us. So that convoy couldn't drive straight to the target. It had to go down main thoroughfares because the Somalis had been fighting in the city for years. It was rubblized. They could only take certain roads to get there, whereas the assault force that I was with, moving on foot, we went from the initial target building and then walked a couple of blocks over to get to the crash site. So as we walked over to that crash site, the convoy was trying to fight its way down the main thoroughfares separate from us. Additionally, there was a quick reaction force that was trying from the UN forces that was trying to fight its way out to us unsuccessfully. But again, from my perspective, moving with the assault force on the ground, we moved about 2 blocks. And again, the clock was really key here. As the clock was ticking, there was more and more Somalis joining the fight, and the fire just increased, literally every minute. So by the time we moved a couple blocks east and then turned north, within a couple more blocks of the crash site, the Somalis were really engaged. I mean, in and among where we were at, and we were fighting them at literally distances of feet. Every man in the task force was firing, trying to defend his corner, his street, his portion of the street. We were taking casualties. As I moved forward, I walked over to one of my guys that had taken a round in the hip. I had to step over him and let a medic behind me patch him up. We had to keep moving to that crash site, and we had to keep fighting our way forward. Fortunately, we were able to close on the crash site and fortify a couple buildings um, at that point. But then it was just an all-out fight to try to hold the positions that we were in.
So, Jim, what's it like to be in a fight like that? Does your instinct kick in? Does your training kick in? What drives you at that point?
Yeah, 100%. I think looking back on it now, I'm more scared now talking about it than I was at the time because you're purely going on instinct and training. That's one of the things that just was reinforced to me 1,000%. I talk about this in the book. All the training I'd gone through in my life, from the Citadel, from basic training, all my training in the Ranger Battalion was culminating at this point. I was seeing things, and your vision kind of gets that, you get that stereotypical tunnel vision, and you're focused only on what's in front of you. Um, and I'm reacting before I'm really cognitively understanding. I'm watching people do things and wondering in my mind, what are they doing, and what are these Somalis doing? Where I knew it was an enemy, and I'm already firing at them before I'm even thinking about it. So it's one of those things. And then also in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I'm focused on what's in front of me, but you also know there's a big picture and that there's thousands of Somalis converging from every direction. And as I talk about in the book, it's like a shield wall. You have to depend on the guys to your left and your right. And that's why that unit cohesion and that training is so important, that you can't take a step back because you're going to be failing the guy to your left and your right. And I just had to have absolute confidence in the guys behind me and around me were taking care of business where they were at, and they were not going to falter and leave me exposed. And I had to do the same thing for them.
What time did you finally get back to your base, and how many troopers did you all lose?
Yeah, so in the middle of that fight, again, my job was to call in fire support. And then once the sniper aircraft, first one was shot down and the second one rolled off, we had attack helicopters with rockets and miniguns. And so I was able to get those going. I called for fire, brought those attack helicopters in. That devastating firepower that they brought really, it didn't stop the Somali attacks, but it gave us some breathing room. And so, we're in the midst of that, as I'm out in the street having to observe these helicopters shooting and correct them and make sure all was being done, safely for us. I was shot by a Somali insurgent who came up about 10 feet behind me over a wall, shot me in the leg,
Mm.
just about took my leg off. So from that point, I was pretty critically injured. I was brought inside the casualty collection point, administered to, and then hours later, about 2:30 in the morning, the UN convoy finally got reorganized, finally fought its way out to us. We had to do some more uh, removal of bodies from the wreckage of the helicopter. That took another couple hours, and then we finally were able to get the convoy out of there. So I arrived at the assembly area, the casualty collection area at the Pakistani Stadium, in relatively safe area, probably about 7:30 or 8 the next morning. So again, about 17, 18 hours on the ground.
Yeah.
And immediately
Yeah.
I was put into the medical system, evacuated by helicopter, and started the process of surgery with the mobile surgical hospital.
So 17, 18 hours of
Right.
what you thought was going to be originally a 1 hour mission.
That exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a remarkable story, Jim, and I'm guessing that most of our listeners weren't even alive yet in 1993. They
Right. Right.
tend to be pretty young people. So, to my listeners, this is a remarkable story. They should absolutely learn about it. Very important military lessons, very important strategic lessons. You mentioned Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda's involvement in some ways. This might have been the first battle in the war on terror.
That's exactly what we call it. Yeah, the first fight against Al Qaeda.
Yeah, and then you ended up in a lot more of those.
I did. That kind of set me up. Once I recovered, some incredible treatment from the Army medical system. I rebuilt my leg, literally 13 surgeries.
Mm.
Rebuilt my leg, but I stayed in the infantry. I went back to the Ranger Regiment at some point, and then the war on terrorism came, But my experience in Somalia really set me up well in many ways through lessons learned for the war on terrorism. And then I participated in that with 4 tours in Iraq and about 8 years in Afghanistan.
So, Jim, I want to get to Ukraine, which is, in some ways the issue of the moment. But I do want to just take a minute and ask you, why did you join the Army in the first place, and why did you stay for as long as you did?
Yeah, I was really lucky. I feel like for as long as I can remember, that was my calling. I was fortunate that I knew exactly what I wanted to do from a very young age and was always going to be a soldier. And it was just a matter of how I was going to serve in the military. So, probably in my teenage years, I got focused on the Ranger Regiment. That's just, again, what I knew I wanted to do in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a calling. And, I loved being a soldier. I went to basic training when I was 17 years old, and with the National Guard. I was still in high school. I loved being in the infantry. I went to the Citadel, the military college, to be commissioned as an officer. And again, I knew that's what I wanted to do. Always did, and it was the right place for me. And I was honored to do it. I was in the right place in every way, shape, and form. So
Yeah, yeah. And then you ended up spending some time at CIA, correct?
I did. So while I was in the military, I was at Special Operations Command because of my Ranger Regiment background, and so I was in 2007. I got to take part in a joint task force between Special Operations Command and the CIA, and so I did a year up there on the staff of that task force. We supported operations in Iraq, trying to counter some of the insurgency aspects there, and that was an
Yeah.
incredible experience, a very learning experience for me, and gave me views obviously outside of the military. And another thing that I got to do while I was there, this wasn't directly part of my duties, but just happened, was one of my comrades who'd been in Iraq with me in an armor brigade. He was a army colonel, was assigned to the National Security Council for President Bush and then President Obama. And as they were trying to grapple with the problem in Afghanistan, things were starting to wind up or looking positive in Iraq. While they were
Yeah.
grappling with
Yeah.
Afghanistan, he asked me to come down and assist. And so I got to spend a couple of weeks working with the National Security Council and advising them on counterinsurgency and what, we thought, we being myself, my personal opinions, not my job with the CIA, my
Mm-hmm.
personal opinions on what we should do from a counterinsurgency perspective, and got a lot of fulfillment in being able to advise the National Security Council and President Bush indirectly on counterinsurgency in Afghanistan.
And from the streets of Mogadishu to the National Security Council.
Incredible, yeah, it was incredible.
Yeah. So Jim, let's switch to Ukraine.
Sure.
When did you first go? Why did you go? And how much time have you spent there in the last 2 years?
Yeah, I first got over there in March of 22. I think I arrived around the 14th of March. Obviously, the invasion was on February 24th, so just about 2 weeks after the initial invasion. I'll be honest, I had my focus, my head down, so to speak, on the war on terrorism so much that I was not paying attention to developments in Ukraine, which, as you know, have really started in 2014.
2014, yeah.
Right. And I was aware of it. I'd talked to some guys that had gone there. I knew where Ukraine was on the map, but that's about it. I did not know at that time who President Zelensky was. But then when things had kicked off there with the invasion, um, it's not that I was one of the people that did not think this was going to happen, but I just wasn't paying that much attention. And it was kind of saber rattling for about a year before the invasion actually started, as I recall. So
Right.
I was focused on my experiences in the war on terrorism. I had finished with that in 2017, late 2017, early 2018. So I'd been kind of out of the saddle for a couple of years back home in South Carolina, and I was, not focused on that development in the world. And then when the invasion started, I was intrigued like everybody else. In fact, my undergraduate degree was at the Citadel was on military operations in World War II on the Eastern Front, most of which took
Wow.
place, or
Wow.
much of
Yeah.
which took place in Ukraine. So it was on
Yeah.
my bucket list to go to places like Kursk and Kharkiv. And so I was really intrigued by it, and like everyone else. And I put the word out through my Ranger network. If there was any opportunities to go, I'd like to. And I got soon thereafter, I was contacted through the Ranger network about an opportunity to go over and serve on a team with Newsmax as
Mm-hmm.
basically security and a team leader and run logistics for a correspondent that was over there. She was actually in Kyiv as the Russians had the city under siege on three sides. So when I went in, pretty incredible story. I got the phone call and was moving literally within about 12 hours. Went on a plane to New York City, and they said, "Well, you're going to arrive in Kyiv around 4, but you'll be on at 6." And I said, "On?" And they said, "Yeah, well, you're going to be the nighttime correspondent." So it was it was one of these things I just kept pinching myself for weeks and weeks. Is this really happening?
Yeah.
It just happened so fast. But I got into Ukraine via Romania. Was met, drove a rental car, had to find the one road open into the city the Russians hadn't cut. We did that. Got up into the city. The Russians were about 10 miles away on three sides. Artillery, firing constantly. But the city center, for whatever reason, was fairly quiet. They weren't hitting the city center. We were out of range of artillery, so the lines remained static like that. And I got my feet on the ground, and as you know, about a month later, about 3 weeks later, the Russians were unable to maintain
Right.
and retreated.
We are talking with Jim Lechner, and we will be right back after a break.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
What other kind of things have you done in Ukraine? Is it the Newsmax the whole time, or did you evolve to do other things?
I did. I evolved to do other things. So obviously, with 27 years in the Army, a lot of experience advising, that's what I wanted to do. The
Yeah.
Newsmax experience was incredible. It was an adventure, but it was a way to get over there. Um, And so after being on the ground with them for about 2 months, I started to find opportunities to support the Ukrainian military, advising and assisting. Later in the year, I joined a training company that was working, a private company that was working on the ground in conjunction with the Ukrainians. We trained about 12,000 Ukrainian soldiers in a period of a year between April and 22 and February of 23. Um, got to do that. At the same time, I was still acting as a military contributor because I didn't want to actively participate with Ukrainian units and then be a journalist. That's kind of against the Geneva Convention. So I was a military contributor for Newsmax, just given my views on what was going on, but mainly training and advising, and then evolving into developing a relationship with a couple of units over there, a couple brigades, and actually getting to actively participate and support their efforts. Because of the Newsmax piece, I've really been to every city in Ukraine, with the exception of Chernobyl, where the nuclear meltdown was, and Sumy. So I've gotten to go to Kharkiv, which was on my bucket list, Odessa, Kherson after it was liberated. Got to do a huge amount of experience doing that, kind of covering that and advising and assisting at the same time. But then as I went more into an active role and assisting the Ukrainians, we were focused out in the Donbass area, out around Kramatorsk. Our efforts to try to hold the city of Bakhmut, and then fighting all around Bakhmut, which continues. So that we just lost Advivka about 3 weeks ago, which is south of Bakhmut, but spent a lot of time in Bakhmut, and then but mainly working out of Kramatorsk and supporting the units as they're trying to hold the line out there.
Yeah, so you're pretty close to the front line.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Kramatorsk, based on the Russian advance, is about 10 kilometers from the Russian front line. So, um, lots of strikes by long range missiles. Now they're starting to use some of their drones and other armed aspects and hitting targets in and around Kramatorsk. So very kinetic area. Lots of artillery fire going on constantly. So we like to say it's like World War I with drones. It's just a very
Yeah,
active
yeah.
front, and I think a lot of people don't realize the front is over 200 miles long. And it's just constant artillery all along that front.
And what are the mindset of the Ukrainian soldiers that you're working with?
Well, for the most part, very very high. All Ukrainians are extremely united. They've been invaded. From their perspective, the Russians have occupied their land. Um, they are trying to destroy their culture and their national identity, and so they're extremely united in their resistance to the Russian invasion. The fighting and the conditions are extremely difficult at the front in the trenches. I mean, they're literally at the trenches in the wintertime. They're in mud and ice, extremely difficult. And so morale goes up and down at the trenches. But as a nation, they're extremely united, extremely supportive of the efforts that are going on, and the soldiers' morale is very high. And I mentioned being in Kyiv when the Russians attempted to take that city and failed. Some of the tactical victories that the Ukrainians achieved early on have just put them in this mindset that they're going to be able, that they can beat the Russians tactically, and that's I found that to be very true. But what's troubling is the Russians are not concerned about what goes on tactically. Their approach is strategic, and that's an extremely different proposition.
Yeah. How many former U.S. military folks are there in Ukraine doing what you're doing?
So again, people that are not serving in the Department of Defense or the U.S. government,
Right, right,
the
right.
the numbers that I've seen or I've heard and that I've kind of assessed myself is probably about 5,000 Americans
Mm.
that cycled through there. Um, Legally, in the Ukrainian system, you have to, if you're a foreigner, you have to serve in the International Legion, and so there's been about 5,000 Americans. There's lots of NGOs that support the effort over there. A lot of people call that the fourth branch of the Ukrainian military. So lots of Western and American NGOs. But fighting on the ground, there's probably been about 5,000 that have cycled through there. Now that's cumulative. At any given time, there's probably 500 to 1,000 Americans serving in the International Legion, by my estimate.
And you certainly know what motivated you, right, to do this. What do you think what do you think motivates former U.S. Mill to serve in those kind of numbers? I mean, it's really impressive.
Well, everybody that I've encountered is there motivated to by the cause of trying to defend the democracy against what we see as the Red Army now, the resurgence of the Red Army in a tyranny. And there's not a lot of money to be made. I keep talking to people back here that think that it's like a rock where you're going to get $1,000 a day. That's not the case. Even when you're serving in the Ukrainian forces, you're not getting anywhere near that, and you're having to pay for a lot of your own sustainment and logistics, like a place to live and food in many cases. So it's not about money in any way, shape, or form over there. I think most of the guys I've run into are motivated by trying to defend a democracy. It's a once in a lifetime experience to experience a conventional war like this, and the cause. Everybody that I've talked to and dealt with, it feels very strongly about.
The Ukrainians, Jim, that you dealt with, what do they think of the United States?
Oh, very positive. They recognize that they received help, from the United States. We might say, or I might personally think that it was not enough and not timely enough. But the Ukrainians definitely see that they were out there alone, and they received help from many European allies and from the U.S., and they're very, very grateful for that. Um, Even when I'm around Kiev, which is a very safe area, a very cosmopolitan city, very high tech city, and very safe, other than occasional airstrikes. But I almost feel guilty because Ukrainians, are so grateful to you for being there. And I said, hey, listen, there's guys in the trenches right now in knee deep ice water, and that's who you ought to be grateful to. And they said, well,
Yeah,
but think about this perspective. When the war started, you know hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians fled the country, but you're coming in and you've come to help us. And so we're so grateful for that. And that gave me a little bit different perspective. So they're very grateful. Occasionally you're kind of treated like a rock star there. But I always think about the guys that are up in the trenches.
yeah, for sure, for sure. You gave us a sense, Jim, of the morale of Ukrainian soldiers. Do you have any sense of the morale of the Russian soldiers on the other side?
I think it varies because, again, at least from what I was taught in the U.S. military and my perspective on the Russians, I don't think I had a very good understanding. Now, I have to temper that by saying I think I had a very good historical knowledge of them, but I'm just shocked. The disconnect is I did not think that the Tsarist armies of World War I and certainly the Stalinist armies of World War II, that the Russians would continue to have a military like that. But that is exactly what I have found to be the case.
Mm,
They have no problem rounding up, calling up classes of conscripts and putting those conscripts into units, and then just sending those units into the machine gun fire, and basically winning through numbers, not through any kind of tactical skill. I'd mentioned this before. The Russians aren't concerned with a tactical fight. What they're concerned with is getting a mass of soldiers and a mass of firepower, and then taking ground. And the casualties are not an issue with them. I've
right.
watched them march thousands of guys into the fight. And so, what you get from a morale perspective is they're not stupid. The Russians certainly are not. Strategically, they're smart, and they've got military units that they focus on. Their airborne units, some of their armored units. They equip those units very well. They train them relatively well, and those units are professional and they have relatively high morale. The conscripts battalions that they send up, which are often composed of prisoners and juvenile delinquents and people like that, homeless people, that's who they just march into the machine gun fire. And again, it's hard for us to grasp, but they just accept that and they move forward. But there are other units that then exploit those opportunities, are relatively professional, and we found the morale to be a little bit higher.
And Jim, what's your sense for where we are on the battlefield at the moment and where we're headed?
Well, I came home right before the holidays, and when I left, I felt very strongly that it was a stalemate. The Russians outnumber the Ukrainians significantly. They can bring up huge amounts of troops every quarter. They bring up about 200,000 troops every quarter. And I try to
Mm,
explain to the Ukrainians that's the same number of troops that invaded the country on the first phase of the operation. So you think about that. That's 200,000 fresh troops every quarter. But with that, again, the Ukrainians are tactically superior to the Russians. They can beat them in the battle. They can beat them in the firefight. And so I didn't, while they're not going to be, the Ukrainians are not going to be able to push back against that kind of number successfully in the long run. I did not think the Russians were going to be able to exploit that either and push the Ukrainians back. And so it was very much a stalemate. Again, a couple hundred miles of front. They've got all kinds of firepower. They've got drones. The Russians, contrary to anything, based on what I've seen, contrary to what the experts are telling us, that the Russians are going to collapse. That's certainly not the case. They are on a wartime footing. They're outproducing the Ukrainians in the West in drones. They seem to be on a good footing for ammunition and supporting the war, and so they're in a relatively strong position. And I didn't think that, but again, I didn't think the Russians were going to be able to advance very far and take any more major cities. But now that the support for Ukraine is starting to waver somewhat from the U.S. and Western allies, I'm becoming more concerned that the Russians may be able to gain some more momentum and gain some more ground. As I mentioned, we lost Avdiivka about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah,
Other
yeah.
parts of the front are starting to experience big difficulties. The Russians continue to advance. And the other thing that I'm hearing that makes me concerned in the long term is the good units in the Ukrainian side are starting to get chewed up pretty significantly in attrition, and they don't have time to reconstitute. They get pulled off the line and then have to get pushed right back into an emergency and continue to get chewed up. And so, in the long term, that's starting to wear out the Ukrainians' ability to win the tactical fight.
So how do you think this ends?
Again, I still feel strongly that the Russians can't make major gains. I don't think they can take the city of Dnipro, which is about 4 hours behind the front. I certainly don't think they can take Kyiv. So while they might be able to make some, I am concerned their growing capability as time goes on, but I still don't think they're going to be able to achieve things like that. But having said that, they've taken 90% of what they wanted. They wanted the Donbass. They wanted to be able to dominate the southern coast. They've been able to do 90% of that. So I don't think they really need to gain much more. And as I
Mm.
said, unfortunately, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be able to achieve their objective of liberating every square foot. And so obviously now the dilemma is you've got a nation very strongly united behind the cause of liberating every square foot of territory, and they're just not going to be able to do it militarily. And so then how is that going to end? Well, I think the Ukrainians are going to have to negotiate at some point. They're going to have to give up significant amounts of territory. I think the best case for them is what advantages they can gain or what resources or assets they can get back from those negotiations. But it's certainly not going to be the rest of the country, and they're just going to have to accept that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Do you think with the right level of Western assistance that that picture could be different?
I do, but I don't blame. I wouldn't say it's all on the West. I think that our support, uh, the West, but the U.S. in particular, I think our support has been about as inept as we saw the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That level of ineptitude.
Mm.
Same thing is the support for Ukraine, and I can go into some detail about that. What I mean by that, but it's not just Western support. We certainly have provided them with ammunition and some weaponry, and that's been critical for the defense and for their operations. But the Ukrainians also, they're still a Soviet style nation and Soviet style military. They've made great efforts to try to westernize, but that just doesn't happen overnight, and it takes a holistic approach to conduct combined arms and joint operations like we do in the West, and they're just not there yet. And until they can achieve those types of operations, they're not going to be able to defeat the Russians. I strongly feel joint operations and combined arms like we do in NATO, like we do in the West, those can defeat the Russians, but the Ukrainians are just not there yet. And so it would take a lot of training for them to develop those units. And part of the ineptitude of what we've done is the training that the British and the United States have provided for the Ukrainians has been completely inadequate and completely inappropriate with, Afghanistan sniper scenarios and IED
Mm.
scenarios, and then
Mm.
expecting that brigade of Ukrainians to go back and fight a conventional war with that kind of training. Just completely, from my perspective, been inept and a poor
Mm.
support for them.
Mm. Mm. So are you going back?
I plan to. Yes, I'm probably not going to do more long deployments. I've done 6 months at a shot on occasion, but I do plan to go back. My unit is still serving over there. I'm still in touch with them, and I really am anxious to try to support them, and I'm going to do that in some way, shape, or form in the near future, I hope.
Jim, just one more question. I read an article that you wrote last year titled "I Miss the Battlefield."
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah, that was really in response to the political environment back here. While the war is very difficult in Ukraine, and there's a lot of tragedy and a lot of just horrible things going on, it's also very refreshing to be in a unified country. Now, many of my friends in Ukraine, did not support President Zelensky, but they do now. They certainly do now, and they're a very unified country. They don't have the divisions, and they're not a perfect society. They have problems, but they certainly don't have the problems that we have. And it's I would say it borders on disgusting to me to come back here and watch the Marxism and the racial divides and the other political things that go on in this country. And so that's what I mean by that is I just get so sick of seeing, to me, what's disgusting in our society go on. Those things, it's almost like a cliche, but when you're in the Army, in the U.S. Army even, when I was fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I had Americans with me, I never experienced those types of problems. It was always, you're an American soldier. I got an American soldier to my right and to my left, and that's what's important. And so I miss that aspect of the battlefield that's lacking here in our society.
I remember how unified we were after 9/11, right?
For a little while.
How that brought us together for at least a little while, right? Sure. And the battlefield, there's great clarity on who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. The book is With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. The author is Jim Lechner. Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
That was Jim Lechner. I'm Michael Morrell. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.